So I'm going to start with integrating quotations. We'll also take a look at some ways to provide context before you go into the quote once we look at the sample paper. Also, there's more discussion of that, of some ways to integrate quotations in a more detailed slideshow in the link to helpful resources that is on this week's page. So you'll see a link there to helpful writing resources. There are video tutorials and links to different websites. There is a slideshow in there that goes into more detail about establishing context before a quote, and then the correct punctuation and capitalization and things like that when you integrate a quote. But I'm going to take you through the cheat sheet that's in there. It's just a quicker way to think about this, specifically how to punctuate and capitalize when you use a quote. So you'll see here, I've got that cheat sheet opened. There are 4 basic ways to set up a quote. So we're going to take a look at those. The first one is probably the one you're most familiar with. It's just a simple signal phrase followed by a comma and then the quoted sentence or sentences. So you can see here, I've identified who says the quote. That's a very important part of context that you need. Is it Laurel? Is it Arnetta? Is it Octavia who's saying the quote? And then you'll notice that there is a comma. You'll notice that the signal phrase uses present tense. We treat stories as if they are alive, as if they're currently happening. So we want to use present tense when we're saying, noting what a character says. And then you'll notice that the material in the quote is a complete sentence. Therefore, I need to capitalize the first letter. Following the quote, you'll notice the page number in parentheses, and then the period actually follows the page number. This is the only time a period goes outside of quotation marks when you're thinking about MLA guidelines and rules, is when you have a parenthetical. Normally, the period goes inside the quotation marks, but anytime you include this parenthetical citation, that period swings to the outside. Something to keep in mind is that generally says is fine as a signal phrase verb. You don't need to get all fancy and try to vary it. It gets kind of tedious for a reader if every time you're using something different just to use something different. Keep in mind it's just basically to signal who's saying the quote, so you don't have to get super creative with the verb that you use in the signal phrase. Generally says is fine. You can vary it a little bit though if you want to. Now, sometimes the thing that you're quoting can be blended into your sentence by using the subordinating conjunction that. So you'll notice the difference here. Even though the quote is exactly the same, the difference is that I have not capitalized what, and I have not included a comma. And the reason for that is because I have used that subordinating conjunction to include a subordinate clause in my sentence now. So this is no longer an independent clause, a complete sentence. Therefore, I do not capitalize it. I've changed it into a subordinate clause by using the that. So if that's all very jargony and confusing, just keep in mind that if you use that after your signal phrase, you do not capitalize, even if this could stand alone as a complete sentence by itself. You still do not capitalize it. And you don't use a comma. So that's the second way to incorporate a quote. The third way is to introduce the quote with a complete sentence. So rather than a simple signal phrase like the narrator says, say I want to provide a little more context, I use a complete sentence followed by a colon. The narrator talks about the reasons for what the soldiers carried, colon, and then I present the quoted sentence. Please note that this is a complete sentence. I didn't say the narrator talks about, or I'm sorry, let me start that over. I didn't say the narrator talks and says colon. So you're not having a colon after says, for example. You actually complete the sentence and then you put the colon and then you introduce the quoted sentence. And then the fourth way to blend in a quote is if you're quoting something that is not a complete sentence. This is similar to that example above. then I just treat it as I would normally in a grammatical sentence. I don't use a comma, and I don't capitalize the beginning of the partial quote. The narrator says that the thing that determined the soldier's baggage was, quote, partly a function of rank, partly of field specialty. No comma, no capitalization because this is not a complete sentence, and no comma because I'm blending it into my own partial sentence. So the 4 ways: simple signal phrase followed by a comma, signal phrases in present tense, capitalize the beginning of the quoted sentence. Very similar, use that. However, if I do a that with my signal phrase, I do not add a comma and I do not capitalize the quoted sentence. Use a complete sentence followed by a colon to introduce my quoted sentence. And lastly, if I'm blending in just a partial sentence into my own sentence, I use neither punctuation nor capitalization. I go right into it. So those are 4 nuts and bolts kind of rules with blending in a quote. Again, the quote or the slideshow in the link to the helpful resources on this week's page goes into a little bit more depth. It has kind of a practice quiz and things like that if you want to practice punctuating and integrating quotes correctly.